Today, I will discuss the life of Colonel Elmer Ellsworth, who died 160 years ago this month. Elmer was the first Union officer lost during the war, and his death had a profound effect on many, including Abraham and Mary Lincoln, who came to care for him like a son. This presentation will focus on his short life and try to convey who he was and how deeply his loss was felt by those who knew him, as well as people across the United States who knew of him. Ephraim Elmer Ellsworth was born in Malta, New York on April 11, 1837, and spent much of his childhood in Mechanicville, New York. Both Malta and Mechanicville are noted with circles on the map, with Mechanicville being the smaller of the two. His father, Ephraim, was a tailor, and his mother, Phoebe, was a homemaker. They named their son after his father, Ephraim, and a family friend named John T. Elmer. Their second son, Charlie, was born 3 years later in 1840. As a teenager, to avoid confusion with his father, he decided to make Elmer his primary name. His father's work as a tailor did not bring the family a lot of money, especially since Elmer was born during a severe financial depression. Ephraim worked a variety of odd jobs, including as an oyster peddler, and Phoebe took in a boarder to help improve the family's financial situation. The Ellsworth family moved to Mechanicville when Elmer was 10 or 11 years old, where they had a larger house with a yard and animals. Mechanicville was a recently incorporated town in eastern New York that was named for the professions of many of its inhabitants who worked in what was known at the time as mechanical arts. Elmer always had a difficult time seeing his parents wear themselves out as they worked to keep the family going, and was often teased about their poverty by his peers. As he recalled when he was a young adult, quote, "Poor as we are and have been, I'm thankful that I cannot recollect of an instance where my father or mother have been guilty of a mean-spirited or ungenerous act." Like many people in these situations, Elmer did not receive a formal education for too long and began working when he was just a teenager. Like Abraham Lincoln, Elmer did not allow this to deter him and continued to educate himself throughout his life. Elmer was interested in the military from a very young age and was especially taken with stories about his great-grandfather's experiences and the American Revolution. He made it clear that he intended to enter the military and spent his time reading books on military drills and tactics. As a teenager, Elmer recruited kids from nearby Stillwater, a town about 3 miles from Mechanicville, and organized them into a military company called the Black Plumed Riflemen of Stillwater, with himself as their drill master. He went on to train several other military companies, but what he really aspired to was to attend West Point, which is what you see pictured here. The renowned military school boasted of educating the best-known military and political figures in the country. Unfortunately, his family's poor economic circumstances and the fact that he lived in a small town without anyone to rely on for assistance meant that West Point remained a dream. Elmer worked in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and New York City in his mid to late teens before heading to Chicago in 1854 at the age of 17. He did well in Chicago, going into business with a friend and establishing himself financially. While he set out on his own, he continually worried about his parents' health and found it difficult to be so far away from them. He wrote to a friend, quote, "I want my parents placed beyond the reach of want, relieved from the necessity of future exertion." He was an ambitious young man and worked hard to improve himself, teaching himself to master writing to avoid betraying his limited formal education. Unfortunately, after spending years becoming independent and earning enough money to help his parents out of their impoverished circumstances, he was robbed by a person he trusted in 1854, just 3 years after he arrived in the city. Both he and his business partner entrusted their earnings to this individual who stole the money, ruining the business and leaving Elmer penniless and in debt. Creditors came after him, and he described insults and infernal stares and attacks on him that like a pack of wolves. He was very alarmed at being considered a dishonest person and later wrote of the psychological effects of this period, stating, quote, I acknowledged no friend and within myself held all at defiance and goaded on almost to madness by disappointment and misfortune bid fate to do its worst. This was not the result of trivial disappointment or trouble, but in consequence of suffering most terrible, rendered more poignant by a pride which forced me to bear in silence and alone what now seems utterly impossible. He spent the next few years repaying his debts, even to the point of starving himself. Elmer never stopped reading about military tactics and became well-versed in the most popular texts on the topic of the period. In 1856, he became captain of the National Guard Cadets, a militia unit in Chicago. It was not unusual for communities of all sizes to have uniformed military companies comprised of men who enjoyed soldiering, which mostly consisted of public demonstrations and parades. Since these groups were usually made up of young men who were well-to-do, Ellsworth was unable to join, but could train them, which he began to do when he was just 19 years old. Elmer was an admirer of the Zouaves, which were Algerian troops fighting with the French army in North Africa, and he employed their training methods with his cadets and designed a colorful uniform with Zouave-style trousers. Elmer worked hard to master the Zouave drilling techniques to teach his men for the public exhibitions they performed. He was so well respected among these men that they soon began to address him as Major Ellsworth. Just prior to the war, the short Zouave-style jacket was adopted by the general public in women's and children's clothing, a trend that continued during the war, as you can see in the fashion plate and photograph from the early years that are shown here. And it's really not uncommon for military styles to come into fashion during wartime. Elmer became such a respected figure for his work with the cadets in Chicago that he was invited to spend the summer of 1858 in Rockford, Illinois, to work as drill master for the Rockford Grays militia group. As you can see in this map, Rockford is about 95 miles west of Chicago in northern Illinois. He was 21 years old and was still working to establish himself financially when he made his way to the city. He was a strict drill master to the Grays, keeping them from enjoying life outside of their time with the group, which meant that the young men of Rockford weren't able to participate in parties or other festivities in those summer months, bringing on the ire of the town's socialites. Elmer was finally convinced to allow a corner of the armory where the men met to be converted into a reception room where the young ladies of the town could watch the drills. It was here that he met 15-year-old Caroline Carrie Spafford, the daughter of a prominent banker in town. Elmer became a regular visitor to the Spafford home and became so close to the family that he later named the newest addition to the Spafford family, the daughter Eugenia, who was born in 1860. He and Carrie became close, and he was gratified that she was receiving an education, as that was not terribly common for women at the time. He soon came to care for her, as is apparent from the affection in his letters, but she was still very young, being only 15 years old during the summer they spent together. Elmer left Rockford in the fall and made his way to Madison, Wisconsin, where he was elected commandant of the Governor's Guard Armory, but he was very unhappy in the new town, where he was so far away from Carrie and her family. Carrie and Elmer continued their correspondence throughout his brief time in Madison, and it appears as if Carrie's parents were aware the pair cared for each other. Elmer visited the family again in January 1859 and spoke to Carrie's father about their attachment. It appears as if Carrie's father may have had doubts about Elmer's suitability for his daughter. He had affection for Elmer, but believed him to be a dreamer and wasn't sure of his future. In addition to her age, her father's biggest concern was the fact that Elmer was not employed, nor did he have a way to support Carrie or himself if they were to marry. Mr. Spafford suggested that Elmer find an apprenticeship at a law office and pass the state bar to become a lawyer before he and Carrie could revisit the idea of marrying one another. So Elmer became determined to do just that. But first, he went home to see his family in Mechanicville, the first visit in 4 years. His parents were very concerned about his younger brother, Charlie, and Elmer tried to give Charlie quite a bit of advice around this time, both in person and in their correspondence. He returned to Illinois and began to study the law on his own, while Carrie went east to continue her education. The pair continued their correspondence, and from his letters and diary entries, it is apparent that he was devoted to her. He began to apprentice with a lawyer in Chicago and continued to work with the cadets as a distraction from his busy life. It was at this point that he changed the name of the group to the United States Zoo of Cadets. He was still impoverished at this time and often wrote of not eating for days and not being able to afford a dentist to take care of a terrible problem with a painful tooth or a doctor when he became ill. It's very disheartening to read about his life at this time. The one positive element in his life was his work with the cadets, which was receiving a lot of attention. The group won Best Drilled Military Unit in the National Agricultural Society in September 1859, and were given the championship flag, which is visible in the background of this photo of Elmer with some of his military friends that was taken the following year. Elmer is the second person from the left. Despite the fact that he had worked with the cadets from 7 p.m. to midnight every night in the weeks leading up to the competition, he said he did not expect to win. Discussing this in a letter to Carrie, he wrote about the moment the winners were announced, and he realized he needed to give an acceptance speech. He said, quote, "I shut my eyes, said a short exhortation, and launched out. I managed to finish somewhere, and the colors were formally handed to me, and by me to the company. The win brought him popularity. As he wrote to Carrie, quote, "All at once, I find myself surrounded by hosts of friends of whose existence I never dreamed before. Friends who think they have discovered that my stock is rising and it will pay to invest." Soon after, he received news that he had been appointed Assistant Adjutant General and Paymaster of Illinois, positions that sounded great, but were unpaid, requiring him to find more jobs to make ends meet. One job he took at this time was as drill master at Lynn's University outside of Chicago, where he worked with students on Saturdays. The boys called themselves the Zoo of Guards. During this time with the school, the nation learned of John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry, and Elmer began to worry that the nation could go to war. Adding to his concerns, he decided to take charge of his younger brother, Charlie, who he and his parents continued to fear was going down the bad path. So Charlie made his way to Chicago to live with Elmer. His new positions as Assistant Adjutant General and Paymaster of Illinois took Elmer to the state capital of Springfield, arriving there for the first time in December 1859. It was here that he met some of the men who would become his closest friends, John Hay and John George Nicolay, names you might recognize as two of Lincoln's secretaries during his time as president. Elmer also became acquainted with some of the very influential people in the city, including John Cook, who was commandant of the Springfield Grays militia group, Governor William H. Bissell, who introduced him to Springfield society, and the Honorable Abraham Lincoln. The circumstances of the first meeting between Elmer and Lincoln were not recorded. Lincoln was well known from his debates with Stephen Douglas 2 years before. His eldest son, Robert, had been a fourth corporal in the Springfield Grays before going to school in New Hampshire, and Lincoln had served on the committee for the Grays when Robert was a part of the group. What is known is that in January of 1860, John Cook wrote to Elmer in Chicago and invited him to move to Springfield permanently to study law under Lincoln, a proposition that Elmer mulled over for a long time before deciding to begin his instruction the following fall. Things really began to improve for Elmer around this time. The Zoo of Cadets were appointed to the Governor's Guard of Illinois by Governor Bissell, likely thanks to his relationship with Elmer. While this new appointment kept Elmer even busier than he already was, he published a manual that eventually came to be known as Manual of Arms for Light Infantry, arranged for the U.S. Zoo of Cadets. Sadly, after these triumphs, his brother Charlie died of smallpox in Chicago in June. This was a terrible blow for the family, especially for Elmer, who had nursed Charlie through a couple of different illnesses that year. He took Charlie's body back home to Mechanicville, but didn't stay for fear that he might be sick himself and infect his parents. He worked through his grief during a summer tour of the Zoo of Cadets through 20 cities throughout the Northeast and down into Baltimore and Washington, D.C. The tour brought the group fame on a larger scale than any of them had expected, bringing gifts and accolades, including the opportunity to march before President Buchanan in Washington, D.C., with their flag on full display. Elmer became a well-known figure on a really large scale, and Carrie's father, who previously disagreed with his work in the militia, came to admire him for his national fame. While Elmer was busy with the cadets, Abraham Lincoln was in the midst of his first presidential campaign, earning the Republican presidential nomination in May of 1860. Lincoln attended the cadet parade in Springfield in August, at a time when, as John Hay wrote, Elmer was, quote, the most talked of man in the country. As planned, Elmer left the cadets after the tour, the group disbanded soon after, and went to work with Lincoln in the early fall of 1860. Lincoln was at the end of his political campaign at the time. Elmer helped by making political speeches on Lincoln's behalf. Lincoln himself did not take to making some speeches during the campaign, unlike candidates do today. About this period, Elmer wrote, quote, I am to speak every day until the election in the county precincts, hurrah for the next president. As John Hay recalled, Elmer was, quote, one of the most popular speakers known to the schoolhouses and barns of central Illinois. Elmer may have been part of the group that joined Lincoln, besides the telegraph, as the election results were coming in on Election Day, November 6th. Lincoln's victory that day opened up new possibilities for Elmer. After playing such a prominent role in the last month of the campaign, he wrote to Carrie, quote, there is a prospect of my plans for the future undergoing a material change. A month and a half after the victory, Elmer wrote to Carrie about his new path, writing, quote, these are my plans. First, to obtain the position of a clerk in the War Department for which I am a candidate. In the event of obtaining this, I should be compelled to reside in Washington for 4 years. The salary just being sufficient to support a family in the economical way. At the expiration of my term, I should go to New York City and commence the practice of law. These plans, he explained, would allow the pair to marry in 2 years, at which point they would immediately commence housekeeping because his parents would be living with them. That letter was written on December 20th, the same day that South Carolina announced its intentions to secede from the United States. This outcome and the fact that it could lead to a civil war was not entirely surprising. South Carolina had threatened to secede before, and a possible war had been a topic of conversation throughout the year. In response, Elmer drafted a bill to reorganize the Illinois state militia in preparation for a war. The bill didn't pass, but as he wrote in a letter, quote, I have decided upon devoting myself to military matters hereafter, to the exclusion of everything else, until my ability fails or I find I must adopt some other means of gaining a livelihood. In the midst of these plans, he entered the bar in Illinois in February 1861. Elmer spent a lot of time with Lincoln throughout the campaign and in the months after. The pair met often, and Elmer visited the Lincoln home regularly. He had a great relationship with Willie and Tad, and Mary doted on him. Lincoln saw a lot of potential in Elmer and wrote of his power to command men and his military ability. When making plans for his departure from Springfield to Washington, D.C., Lincoln invited Elmer to travel with him along with his secretaries, Hay and Nicolay. Both were, of course, friends of Elmer. Elmer set about ordering new clothes for himself and Nicolay, a greater expense than he was accustomed to, as he noted in a letter, quote, I find that this matter of accompanying the president-elect involved an expense which, if I were not a prospective millionaire, would make my pocketbook exceedingly easy of transportation. Elmer's role was in security, an important consideration since threats against Lincoln's life were well known. Part of the instructions that were circulated for those involved in the travel plans included the following, quote, the president-elect will under no circumstances attempt to pass through any crowd until such arrangements are made as will meet the approval of Colonel Ellsworth, who is charged with the responsibility of all matters of this character. And to facilitate this, you will confer a favor by placing Colonel Ellsworth in communication with the chief of your escort immediately upon the arrival of the train. The train stopped in many of the cities where Elmer and the Zoovs toured in the summer before, including New York City, where he had an opportunity to see Carrie briefly, since she was living in Brooklyn with an uncle while attending school. The biggest danger was in Baltimore, where a plot had been discovered by the Pinkerton Agency. So Lincoln went through the city in secret ahead of schedule and finally made it to Washington, D.C. The party remained at the Willard Hotel until the inauguration, which Elmer attended along with the ball that evening, a fact noted by the New York Times, who named him among the people who arrived with Robert Lincoln and John Hay. Within days of the inauguration, Lincoln recommended Elmer to the Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, and the men began to discuss plans to create a military bureau, of which Elmer would be in charge. Elmer was appointed a second lieutenant and given the salary of a major, a fact that brought a lot of criticism in anti-Lincoln newspapers, including the Chicago Times, which wrote, quote, "Zouave O. The Telegraph announces that Mr. Lincoln has requested General Cameron to appoint Colonel Ellsworth of Chicago Zouave notoriety to the fat office of Chief Clerk of the War Department. Oh my, calico colonels are in the ascent. And who is it, pray, that Mr. Lincoln is so anxious to put into a $2,200 a year office? A mere adventurer, formerly the pompous captain of the Chicago Zoo of Cadets, who went into the show business and traveled on free passes all over the Union last summer. A second lieutenant of fuss and feathers, vive la humbug, won't he make a roaring chief clerk of the War Department?" To get away from his troubles, Elmer planned a trip to visit Carrie in New York in April. But before the trip, the war began and everything changed for the couple. Following the attack at Fort Sumter, Lincoln issued a call for troops. As I mentioned before, the start of the war was not a huge surprise, and Elmer already had a plan in place. He resigned his commission and decided to raise a regiment. Lincoln gave him a letter of recommendation. Addressed to Elmer, it read in part, quote, "I have been and am still anxious for you to have the best position in the military which can be given you, consistently with justice and proper courtesy towards the older officers of the army." With this letter in hand, Elmer went to New York, where he met with Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, and showed him Lincoln's letter. Greeley wrote an editorial about the meeting, writing that Elmer had attractive manners and great intelligence. He recalled that Elmer stated, quote, "I want the New York firemen, for there are no more effective men in the country, and none with whom I could do so much. They are sleeping on a volcano at Washington, and I want men who can go into a fight now." The men of the fire department responded with enthusiasm, and within days, Elmer's fire zouaves were in the process of being organized. The state of New York raised $60,000 to cover the costs of outfitting the men, much of it due to the support that Elmer had following his trip through New York City with the Chicago Cadets the summer before. The new regiment were issued modified army uniforms that included red zouave shirts. Many also wore armbands denoting the fire company to which they belonged. The regiment was organized with officers within 5 days of Lincoln's call for troops, and Elmer was, of course, elected the group's colonel. Elmer telegraphed the news to Washington, D.C., and his friend John Hay responded by saying, "Much is hoped from the gallant colonel's blood tubs. They would be worth their weight in Virginia currency at Fort McHenry tonight." Blood tubs was another name for thugs. Fort McHenry in Baltimore was rumored to be in danger of an attack, and so that's what he was referring to in that statement. Colonel Ellsworth and his fire zouaves were given a big send-off, very emotional and very supportive in New York. Elmer's mother actually made a trip to New York to say goodbye and wish him luck. He assured her that God would take care of him. The regiment departed aboard a steamship and made their way to Annapolis before taking a train to Washington, D.C. They arrived in the Capitol ready for a fight, saying things like, "Can you tell us where Jeff Davis is? We're looking for him." And "Is there any secession flags about here?" There are stories about them ordering large meals at restaurants and telling the owners to charge it to the US government or the Southern Confederacy. Other stories tell of them being rambunctious in the streets, and some stories tell of them causing real problems. This obviously did not sit well with Elmer, who had very strict rules for his men. He paid out of pocket for any damages they caused and sent a few of the worst offenders back to New York. The regiment was sworn in as the 11th New York Regiment on May 7th at the Capitol, and Elmer made a speech that John Hay described as having more common sense, dramatic power, tact, energy, and eloquence than any of the speeches in Congress. During the speech, Elmer proclaimed that unlike other regiments, the 11th New York would be enlisted for the whole year, news that was not well received by all of the men who were enlisting at that time. They were the first regiment to be sworn in, and because of Elmer's relationship with Lincoln, were given everything their leader asked for. As I mentioned before, the Zouaves and Zouave style became very popular with the public in both women and children's clothing. Even Willie and Tad Lincoln admired the Zouaves and formed a, quote, soldier company with other children that they called Mrs. Lincoln Zouaves. And Tad had his portrait taken wearing the uniform, which you can see on the book cover that's shown here. The image on the left is called The Domestic Blockade and was illustrated by Thomas Nast to show support for the Union war effort on the home front. After returning to Washington, D.C. from New York with his regiment, Elmer noticed one obvious and upsetting change in that a large Confederate flag was now visible across the Potomac in Alexandria, Virginia. It flew over the Marshall House, an inn that was run by a man named James Jackson. As John Hay recalled, this rebel flag could be clearly seen from the White House, and Lincoln described it as an insult in a conversation with Elmer. The state of Virginia rejected secession as late as April 4th, 1861. With Lincoln's call for troops after the attack at Fort Sumter, state leaders then changed their tune and voted to secede on April 17th. This was really posing a major threat to Washington, D.C. and to Lincoln himself. You can see here an image of the Ordinance of Secession and part of the text where they clearly state that their concern was that the federal government perverted federal powers to the injury of the people of Virginia and to the oppression of the Southern slave-holding states. Virginia was admitted into the so-called Confederacy on May 7th, 1861, the same day the Fire Zouaves were sworn in as the 11th New York Regiment. But the state had not yet voted to ratify the Ordinance of Secession, so there really wasn't anything that could be done until that occurred. As you may know, Alexandria, Virginia is only about 8 miles from Washington, D.C., so the large flag that flew over the Marshall House was really unavoidable for many parts in town. And it really did offend many people, but particularly Elmer personally. He was greatly affected by Lincoln's reaction to it. A few days after being sworn in, Elmer and the 11th New York were moved to a camp about 4 miles away on the road to Alexandria. As he explained in the letter to Carrie, quote, "We expect to fight within 10 days. My regiment is promised a post of honor." The camp was named Camp Lincoln and was in a defensive position between the Capitol and Alexandria. Once news arrived that Virginia ratified the Ordinance of Secession on May 23rd, Elmer and his men quickly prepared to move into the city. That night, a reporter from the New York World visited their camp and found Elmer in the middle of a speech to his men, where he reportedly said, quote, "All I can tell you is to prepare yourselves for a nice little sail, and at the end of it, a skirmish. Go to your tents, lie down, and take your rest until 2 o'clock when the boat arrives. We will go forward to victory or death." Over in Alexandria, residents celebrated Virginia's Ordinance of Secession with James Jackson, the person who ran the Marshall House, leading the festivities. An ardent secession sympathizer, Jackson actually commissioned the flag to be made by a woman in town in Alexandria just a couple of weeks before. When defiantly raising the flag over the inn, Jackson promised that it would only be removed over his dead body. After the secession vote, residents of Alexandria were bracing for an attack. Many had already left the city by this time, seeing the writing on the wall once Virginia's secession vote was made known. The United States plan was to send first a message under a flag of truce to allow soldiers to leave the city. And then they also hoped to take the city's leaders without any bloodshed. Interestingly, before the attack, Alexandrians requested that the Zouaves not be among the troops who took the city, possibly a sign that Elmer's fame and reputation were well known to city residents. He cautioned his men to, quote, do nothing to shame the regiment. Show the enemy that you are men as well as soldiers, and that you will treat them with kindness until they force you to use violence. I want you to kill them with kindness. Elmer spent the rest of the evening before the attack in preparation with his officers, before sitting down to write 2 letters, one to his parents and the other to Carrie. To his parents, who were always his main concern, he wrote, quote, my dear father and mother, the regiment is ordered to move across the river tonight. I am inclined to the opinion that our entrance to the city of Alexandria will be hotly contested. Should this happen, my dear parents, it may be my lot to be injured in some way. Whatever may happen, cherish the consolation that I was engaged in the performance of a sacred duty. And tonight, thinking over the probabilities of the morrow and the occurrences of the past, I am perfectly content to accept whatever my fortune may be, confident that he who noteth even the fall of a sparrow will have some purpose, even the fate of one like me. My darling and ever-loved parents, goodbye. God bless, protect, and carefree, Elmer. Then to Carrie he wrote, my dear darling Kitty, my regiment is ordered to cross the river and move on Alexandria within 6 hours. We may meet with some warm reception, and my darling, among so many careless fellows, one is somewhat likely to be hit. If anything should happen, darling, just accept this assurance. The only thing I can leave you, the highest happiness I look for on earth, was a union for you. You have more than realized the hopes I formed regarding your advancement, and I believe I love you with all the ardor I am capable of. You know, my darling, any attempt of mine to convey an adequate expression of my feelings must be simply futile. God bless you as you deserve and grant you a happy and useful life, and us a union thereafter. Truly your own, Elmer. P.S. Give my love to mother and father. Such they truly were to me, and thank them again for all their kindness to me. I regret I can make no better return for it. Again, goodbye, God bless, my own darling. Many have speculated that Elmer did not expect to survive this mission. Both letters reference this, as is the story of Captain Jack Wildey, who helped Elmer dress for the battle. According to Wildey, Elmer carefully chose his uniform and said to him, quote, I was thinking of what clothes I shall dye. If I am to be shot tomorrow and I have a presentiment that my blood is immediately required by this country, it is in this suit that I shall die. The transport ships arrived at midnight, the steamships arrived a couple of hours later, and the soldiers moved out on the ships in the early morning hours. Elmer's ship arrived in the city around dawn. The residents had already been given an hour's notice to allow for troops to move out. Elmer then began to order his men to the city, ordering them to destroy railroad tracks, and then led a group himself into the center of town to destroy telegraph lines. Those with him included the chaplain, who was Reverend W.W. Dodge, a reporter from the New York Tribune named Edward H. House, Sergeant Frank B. Marshall, and then 4 corporals, one of which was Francis Brownell. As you can see from this letter from the Shrine's collections, the public was very aware of what was happening in Alexandria. Reporters had been present at camp the night before, and as I mentioned, journalist Edward House not only accompanied the regiment to Alexandria, but was also part of the small group who moved into the city with Elmer. Given the proximity of the city to Washington, D.C., and the fame that Elmer and the Zouaves had at the time, people were especially anxious about the outcome. Once Elmer and his small group moved into the city, they spotted the offensive flag over the Marshall House, which is pictured here. As Edward House reported, Elmer was torn between what to do first, cut the telegraph lines or tear down the flags. Before anyone knew it, Elmer made up his mind, ran towards the Marshall House with his group behind him. They entered and met a half-dressed man and asked who raised the rebel flag, only to be told that this man was a boarder. Elmer posted one man at the door, another one on the first floor, and then another one on the third floor, while the rest went with him into the attic and then onto the roof where he cut down the flag. The group descended the staircase with Corporal Francis Brownell up front and Elmer behind him. As they reached the base of the stairs, a man came out of the shadows, pointed his shotgun at a distracted Elmer. Corporal Brownell tried to stop him, but couldn't, and Elmer was hit in the chest, slumping immediately. The shooter was James Jackson, proprietor of the Marshall House and the person who claimed to be a boarder when the group first entered the property. After shooting Elmer, Jackson quickly turned his gun on Brownell, but was blocked, and Brownell managed to shoot him, hitting him in the face, and then bayoneted him before he realized his shot had been fatal. That is what is depicted in this illustration that shows Jackson shooting a larger-than-life Elmer while Brownell points his weapon at him. Once Jackson was killed, the group turned their attention to Elmer, who was lying in a pool of blood. He was taken into a bedroom where his men covered him with the rebel flag while they waited for help to arrive. Edward House, the reporter who was with them, asked for and was given permission to complete Elmer's missions to cut the telegraph lines. Elmer's body was wrapped in a Zouave red blanket and transported on a steamer, its flag at half-mast, to the Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. When news of his death was known, it became difficult to restrain the men, especially the grieving Zouaves, from moving in and destroying Alexandria. News spread quickly throughout Washington, D.C. and the surrounding area that the famous Colonel Ellsworth had been killed. In this letter from the Shrine's collections, written from Fort McHenry in Baltimore, Sayre Ennis relays the news to his father, where he wrote of Elmer's death, as well as the fact that, quote, valuable plans were seized during the raid. Other than the tragedy at the Marshall House, the city of Alexandria had been taken without much resistance. The next morning, Elmer's anxious father visited the telegraph office in Mechanicville to learn the outcome of the battle because he and his wife knew Elmer might be involved. He soon found out as the message came in and the operator burst into tears. Sadly, Carrie found out in a similar way. Lincoln was informed by an officer that same day. Two men who had a meeting with him at the time saw him burst into tears and cover his face while he paced the room. He said, quote, I will take no apology, gentlemen, for my weakness, but I knew poor Ellsworth well and held him in great regard. John Hay recalled that both Abraham and Mary Lincoln warned Ellsworth like a son. Mary actually visited the Navy Yard to leave some flowers for Elmer, but was unable to see him because he was being embalmed. But she did meet and spend time with Francis Brownell, who relayed the story to her as they both wept. She returned later in the day with her husband, and as John Hay reported, Lincoln explained, my boy, was it necessary the sacrifice should be made? In examining his clothing, the letters he wrote to his parents and Carrie were found, along with Carrie's portrait. They also discovered a gold medal with the inscription in Latin, quote, not for ourselves, but for our country. Elmer's body was taken to the East Room of the White House, where the funeral was held. The coffin was draped in the stars and stripes and visited by many people who stopped by to pay their respects to the popular young man. As John Hay recalled, Elmer had, quote, the power of grappling to his heart with hooks of steel, the affection of every man with whom he came in contact. All classes seemed to regard his death as a personal affliction. The Lincolns and the president's cabinet attended the funeral, with Mary and her husband openly weeping, as seen here. The coffin was then moved down Pennsylvania Avenue to the depot, followed by military companies as crowds lined the streets weeping. A carriage carried Lincoln, members of his cabinet, and Elmer's friend, Nicolay, who said that Elmer's death, quote, was more to me than a brother's loss. Corporal Brownell carried the blood-stained flag and participated in the ceremonies as well. Elmer's body was then taken on a special train to New York City, where his parents and relatives received it at the Astor House, which is shown in this illustration, where they held private funeral services. The final letter he wrote to his parents was read aloud. Carrie was too distraught to attend. Elmer was then moved to New York City Hall, where he lay in state, just as President Lincoln would 4 years later. Approximately 10,000 people viewed his body. The New York Tribune reported on this, with its reporter writing, quote, "Never has a man of Ellsworth's age commanded such national respect and regard in so short a space." From New York, he was transported to Albany, where he was again taken to the Capitol for people to pay their respects. Finally, Elmer was transported to Mechanicville, where people lined up to see the coffin as it was taken to Hudson View Cemetery. President Lincoln wrote to Elmer's parents on May 25th, expressing the grief he and Mary felt at the loss of Elmer, writing, quote, "My dear sir and madam, in the untimely loss of your noble son, our affliction here is scarcely less than your own. So much of promised usefulness to one's country and of bright hopes for one's self and friends have rarely been so suddenly dashed as in his fall." And then in closing, he wrote, "In the hope that it may be no intrusion upon the sacredness of your sorrow, I have ventured to address you in this tribute to the memory of my young friend and your brave and early fallen child. May God give you that consolation which is beyond all earthly powers. Sincerely your friend in common affliction, A. Lincoln." As seen in this letter from the Shrine's collections, 1 month later, Lincoln honored Elmer's memory once again by recommending his friend and fellow member of the 11th New York Zoovs, Lieutenant Edwin Coates, for promotion, writing, quote, "If there still be any vacancies of lieutenant in the regular army, I wish one of them given to Edwin W. Coates, named within. He was one of Colonel Ellsworth's nearest friends and a good drill officer." Lincoln also went a step further and commissioned Elmer's father, Ephraim, as a captain in the Ordnance Department, providing the grieving parents with financial stability, as their son had always wished for them. John Hay, one of Elmer's closest friends, wrote a memorial to him in the Washington Chronicle in the days that followed his death. He wrote in part, quote, "It is certain that no man could have died more deeply lamented than the young hero who is moving today in solemn grandeur towards the crushed hearts that sadly wait him in the North. Mourn him in tears as the truest, tenderest, most loyal-hearted man that ever died. I do not remember but two faults that he had, and they were magnificent ones. He was too generous and too brave." Hay sent Elmer's belongings to his parents and asked to keep his sword, but his father, Ephraim, wouldn't part with it. Carrie was understandably devastated by his death. She visited Elmer's parents in Mechanicville a couple of months later after his death, and she wrote this letter that you see here to Hay, acknowledging the arrival of the trunk containing Elmer's belongings. The letter is from the Lincoln Financial Foundation collection. Carrie was only 18 years old at the time of his death. She did go on to marry a man named Frederick Bent a few years later, and the pair had a son. The nation also mourned the loss of the popular Colonel Ellsworth, with sermons, editorials, poems, and songs written in his memory. Colonel Ellsworth's funeral march was written in his honor, and Mary Lincoln asked the young friend to perform it for her and her husband. Both the funeral march sheet music and poem you see here are from the Shrine's collections. The New York Times editorial stated, quote, "His memory will be revered, and long after the rebellion shall have become history, his name will be enrolled upon the list of our country's greatest patriots." The editor of the New York World wrote, quote, "He was a hero in the fairest and most captivating sense of the word." Soldiers wore mourning crepe for a month after his death, and the mantra, "Remember Ellsworth," became a rallying cry for the 11th New York Zoovs for the remainder of their time in service. It could also be seen in letterhead and correspondence between soldiers and their loved ones at home. As seen in this map of Alexandria, a fort was also named after him. Fort Ellsworth was located just outside of the city where he died and was part of a system of 160 forts and batteries that made up the defenses of Washington, D.C. It was used throughout the war and demolished in 1865. Elmer was the first nationally renowned military figure to die for the war effort, and his death brought even more support for the Union cause. His manual of arms for light infantry, arranged for the US Zoo of Cadets, was republished that year as Zoo of Drill Book, with his likeness and biography as selling points. Many people named their children after him, and his name became synonymous with heroic attributes. Enlistment in the military increased in the period following his death, and a new regiment, the 44th New York Infantry, was soon organized, known as Ellsworth's Avengers. They went on to serve in the majority of the war and took part in the major campaigns in the Eastern Theater, including the battles of Antietam, Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, Cold Harbor, just to name a few. His legacy also lived on in the 11th New York Infantry, which served in the First Battle of Bull Run on July 21st, 1861, just 2 months after his death. The regiment was mustered out in June of 1862. As for Francis Brownell, Elmer's actual avenger, he was given a commission in the Army and served until November 1863, when he retired as a first lieutenant. He worked as a clerk in the pension office in Washington, D.C. in the post-war years and lived in St. Louis, Missouri later in his life. He was awarded the Medal of Honor in 1877 with the inscription, quote, "For gallantry in shooting the murderer of Colonel Ellsworth at Alexandria, Virginia." He was the first person to be awarded that distinction. He lived until 1894 and is buried in St. Louis. Another consequence of Elmer's death is that Alexandria, and the Marshall House specifically, became tourist destinations. And this letter from the Shrine's collections, Clara Horton, the wife of Congressman Valentine Horton of Ohio, wrote about visiting Alexandria and the Marshall House the following year, writing in part, "We saw the hotel where Ellsworth met his death. The flagstaff is still there, and an American flag on the upper story showing the place where he fell. The windows in that story are all out, so that you look in from the side walls." Tourists who visited the city often took parts of the building, particularly the staircase and the floor where he died, as mementos. They can occasionally be found online for sale. The Marshall House underwent many changes in the years that followed. It was sold in 1873 and then burned down in 1877. The building that it was replaced with was then demolished and replaced with the building you see here in the 1950s. Today, it is the Alexandrian Hotel, but it has had many names over the years. The sons and daughters of Confederate soldiers were given permission to place this plaque on the building at some point in the early 20th century. The exact year is unclear. As you can see, it reads, "The Marshall House stood upon this site, and within the building on the early morning of May 24, 1861, James W. Jackson was killed by federal soldiers while defending his property and personal rights as stated in the verdict of the coroner's jury. He was the first martyr to the cause of Southern independence. The justice of history does not permit his name to be forgotten. Not in the excitement of battle, but coolly and for a great principle, he laid down his life, an example to all, in defense of his home and the sacred soil of his native state, Virginia." Just as Elmer became a martyr for the North, James Jackson, the man who killed him, became a Southern martyr. And as you can imagine, many people were offended by this particular interpretation of that event and advocated for the plaque's removal. It did remain on the building until it was purchased by Marriott in 2017, when the plaque was removed and given to the local chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. In 1874, a monument with a 300-pound bronze eagle was erected at Elmer's burial site. The grave was the site of a centennial commemoration of his death in 1961, at which time there were also efforts to name the Ellsworth home in Mechanicville as a national monument. Those efforts were ultimately rejected by the Department of Interior, citing the fact that Elmer's death came at the hands of a civilian and not a soldier on the battlefield, which they said disqualified him from being considered the first Union officer to die during the war. He was honored with a marker in the city of Malta, where he was born. And in 1997, the eagle from his monument was stolen, and the thieves attempted to sell it to an antiques dealer who recognized it and contacted the authorities. It was then returned to the monument shortly after that. The monument itself was added to the National Register of Historic Places in the 1970s. Here's a flag that Elmer removed from the Marshall House. After his death, Lincoln kept the flag and it became a plaything for Tad. It eventually went to Francis Brownell and remained in his family for many years. Many people took fragments of the flag as mementos, several of which can be found in museums across the country. The flag itself is in the New York State Military Museum and Veterans Center collection. You can see it here when it was displayed about 10 years ago. The museum also owns the kepi that Elmer was wearing when he died and the frock coat with the bullet holes still prominently visible. It has been on display many times over the years because people continue to be interested in the story of this energetic, intelligent young man whose death caused a nation to grieve. That is certainly what drew me to his story and to this commemoration of his death. One last thing is that this presentation would not have been possible without Ruth Painter Randall's amazingly detailed biography of Elmer that was written in the 1960s. You see the title here. There's also a new biography that has been written by Meg Rowling, and it will be published or available for purchase in July. You can find her work on emerging Civil War, but do look for her new book, First Fallen, The Life of Colonel Elmer Ellsworth, the North's first Civil War hero, out in a couple of months. With that, thank you so much for being here as we commemorated the life of Colonel Elmer Ellsworth. We'd also like to thank the Carroll Foundation, whose generous grant made this program possible.